Today we're going to look at Psalm 127, and I titled this, Notice this psalm is not about you. Or is it? So very often we say it's all about God. It's not about us, but this is about God and us. And so as we look at this beautiful psalm, and indeed it is one of the high points in these Psalms of Ascent. In fact, it's the middle psalm of the Psalms of Ascent. And I keep coming back to this whole picture of Joseph and Mary and Jesus as they were walking toward Jerusalem on their pilgrimage during the time of the Passover, one of the 3 times of the year that the Jews were asked to come to Jerusalem for worship. And so it's about 90 miles from Nazareth to Jerusalem. The pilgrims would probably take a week or more to travel, and that probably included a Sabbath when they stopped and didn't do anything. And so interestingly, they didn't just go as one little family group. They went as a whole village together, a whole group together, for a couple of reasons. Number one, for the fellowship, but number 2, for protection, and also for mutual support. And so there were probably all kinds of people that were involved there. Families of whose husband was carpenter, such as Joseph. Some perhaps shepherds' families, bakers' families, olive growers' families, cheesemakers' families, grain growers' families, day laborers' families, fishermen's families, perhaps a rabbi and his family, shopkeepers and families, sandal makers and families, along with all their wives and children. So this must have been quite a colorful and wonderful undertaking. And so Psalm 127 literally is focused on the family. Families, how they grow and how they prosper. They grow and prosper by the graceful work of God and the diligent, obedient work of fathers and mothers. Psalm 127 is a pilgrim song about the divine providence that must bless what God does for there to be success. It's the 8th in this Song of Ascents. And so in the 15 Psalms, this is the central one. This is the middle psalm. It's the center, perhaps even the capstone of the whole collection of these Psalms. It's kind of a pivot point. It's the densest of all of the metaphors that we find in these 15 Psalms. Over and over and over again, we find a metaphor. So that's why I talked about metaphors a little bit. The Bible begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? We know that. It doesn't say in the beginning, God sat in the majestic heavens. It says that God created. That's the very first things. He created, he did something, he made something. He fashioned the heavens and the earth. The week of creation was a week of work. The days are described not by weather conditions, not by horoscope readings, not by any silliness. They're described as days that God worked and made what we have. Genesis chapter 1 is a journal of a work week. God works. God makes our work meaningful because he works. And God rewards our work for him. It's important for us to remember that God didn't just place us here to do nothing. He placed us here to do his work. Now, A possible connection with Psalm 127 can be found in John 15:5, where Jesus tells his disciples that apart from him, they could do nothing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, the Apostle Paul reassures his readers by saying, you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So work is dignified. Work is godlike. God has made work into a Christ-like endeavor for you and for me. Now let's jump into this psalm. And first of all, let's see the house that God builds. And so in verse number 1, it says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who builds it. And so the metaphor here is God is a carpenter or a contractor. I'm reminded of the words of Zechariah whenever we think about building. The prophet came alongside the beleaguered Jewish laborers who needed to get back to rebuilding the temple. And he said to them, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was a guy that took the first group back to the Holy Land from Babylon. Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. In other words, we're not working on our own horsepower. We're working by the strength and the energy and the power of God himself. Unless the Lord builds this house, those who labor build it in vain. And so it's extremely important that we remember that work independent of God is all vanity. December 1989, the government of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu was toppled in December of 1989. They were tried for murdering 60,000 Romanians over a 24-year period of time. In the wake of their execution, by the way, on December 25th, it was disclosed that the Ceausescus had spent $800 million on a 150-room villa situated in the center of Bucharest. It was unfinished. It was so-called the House of the Republic. 49,500 square yards in the center of 3 square miles. 15,000 workers had labored for years, 24 years, rebuilding parts of it until it suited the Ceausescus. The marble foyer was rebuilt 8 times. The house was not intended for guests. It was for the Ceausescus. It was their private sanctuary. In 1989, it was still 4 years from completion, already 24 years in the making, and they died. They died. You know, when we think about building on our own, building houses, building lives, building families, building churches, building anything on our own is a very futile effort. One commentator said that the lintels on our houses all ought to have these Latin words, Nisi Dominus frustra. Except the Lord builds, we labor in vain. And indeed, isn't that true? Isn't that true? Unless the Lord builds, we labor in vain. The Lord is our carpenter. Look what it goes on to say in the first verse. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. See the city that God protects. So God is, the metaphor of God here is a sentry, a watchman. The Great Wall of China was built to defend China from outside invaders, the Mongols and all of those tribes, semi-civilized tribes that lay outside of the heart of China. They wanted to keep them out. The wall's 4,000 miles long. It's over 20 foot high. It ranges in width from 12 to 40 feet. It's about as secure as you can get, but the Mongols had no problem getting in. You know how they got in? They bribed a guard. They bribed a guard. No watchman. No watchman. Spurgeon's magazine that he passed out, especially to preachers of his day, was called The Sword and the Trowel. And it was, the title was taken from the book of Isaiah, where it says that while the Jews rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, they had a trowel in one hand to do the work, and they had a sword in the other hand to defend against attack. And so there had to be somebody that was watching out, watching for the enemy, taking stock to make sure that there would be safety involved. So is there a great example in the Bible of someone who listened and watched? I think there is. I think you find one in Joseph, the husband of Mary, literally the legal father of Jesus. You know, whenever the wise men came and said, "We saw his star in the east and we've come to worship the King of the Jews." Well, that didn't set well with Herod. And so he said, "Well, whenever you find him, tell me so I can go and worship him too." Yeah. So what did the wise men do? They went home by another way. They didn't go back to Herod. And it's really interesting that Joseph heard from the angel again in a dream, and the angel said, "You need to get away from here." And so what did Joseph do? He took Mary and the baby and escaped to Egypt. Now I want to tell you, God protects those who listen to him. God protects those who listen to him. And so the third picture we see, not just of a carpenter, not just of a sentry, but we see the bread that God provides. So God is compared to a farmer. It says in verse 2, "It is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors, for he gives his beloved sleep, or gives to his beloved even in his sleep." Work is a major component of most of our lives, isn't it? It's unavoidable, and it could be either good or bad, an area where our sin can be magnified or where our faith matures. And so it's really important that we recognize that God labored, but he labored not in vain. He labored not in futile effort, but there was gain from what he did. Hilary Poitiers taught that every Christian must be constantly vigorous or vigilant against what he called the blasphemous anxiety to do God's work for him. We sometimes have to allow God to take charge. How are you going to grow grain other than planting the seed and waiting for it to grow? You can't do anything about that seed. It's going to do it itself. You know, and sometimes we just get ourselves so wrapped up in work that we forget that unless it's for the Lord, it really is in vain. I heard a story of a little first grade girl, and her daddy was one of these guys that when he'd come home from work, he carried a briefcase home with him. And after supper, he'd open the briefcase and spread all of his work out on the table, and he would work until the little girl had gone to bed. And so one day the little girl said to her mom, "Why does daddy work so hard?" And so the mom said, "Well, daddy has so much to do that he can't finish it at the office." And so, using the little girl's logic, she said, "Well, why don't they put him in a slower group?" I was often in the slower group in school. How about you? You know, sometimes we need to put ourselves in a slower group, don't we? And recognize that God is the one who's in charge. One of the commentators said, "Those who put their complete trust in the Lord may rest assured that he knows their needs and he will provide for them, and that agonizing and laboring in fear and anxiety will not get any more done than what he chooses to give. The life of faith is a life that rests in him. It may be diligent and industrious, but it will be free of restless anxieties." You know, there's nothing wrong with working hard and being tired, but there is something wrong with working hard and being anxious, because being anxious doesn't make you tired. It exhausts you. It depletes you. God's special name for Solomon was Jedediah, beloved. That's what Jedediah means, beloved. All of God's people are God's beloved. In Romans 1, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, it talks about that we are God's beloved. We are Jedediah to God. They are accepted and blessed in the beloved one in Jesus Christ. It's because of what Jesus Christ has done. The last line of verse 2 is translated and interpreted in several different ways, but the thrust of it seems very clear. We get tired in God's work, but we do not get tired of God's work. We get tired in God's work, but not tired of God's work, because the Lord who gives us strength to work also gives us the rest that we need. Sleep of a laboring man is sweet, found in Ecclesiastes. But even as we sleep, God works for us in different ways, for he never slumbers or sleeps. As we go to bed at night, we may look backward and wish we'd worked better or harder, accomplished more, had fewer interruptions, but we can commit the day's work to the Lord and not fret after a hard day's ministry. Jesus was able to go to sleep on a boat when the sea was in the midst of a terrible storm. We should be able to sleep in that same way. If God is first in our lives, he will reward us even in our sleep. A godly life includes rest and relaxation, says Charles Swindoll. So here we have a metaphor of God as a carpenter, God as a sentry, God as a farmer, and now we're going to see a beautiful, beautiful picture of God as our procreator. So in verses 3 through 5, I want you to see the sons that God awards. Behold, the children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with the enemies in the gate. So 3 things I want you to see here. Number 1, children are God's gifts to parents. Not everyone is supposed to be married, and not every married person will have children. But all adults can value children and pray for them, be good examples to them, and see that they are protected and cared for and encouraged in their spiritual upbringing. Remember the words of Jesus that when he said in Matthew chapter 18, whosoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whosoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Children are God's gift to parents. At the close of one of his evangelistic crusades, Dwight L. Moody was approached by an enthusiastic woman, and she said, Dr. Moody, I believe God has called me to the preaching of the gospel. And so Moody said, well, I think that's wonderful. I think that's absolutely wonderful that she was able to discern the will of God in such a wonderful way. And then he said, well, tell me about your family. And she said, well, I have a husband and 11 children. And Moody said, thank God, dear Lord, for this woman. He has not only called her to preach, but he has given her a ready-made congregation. Being a devoted and godly parent is not a small thing in God's eyes. It's an important thing. It's an important thing. Children are like arrows given by God. Look at verses 4 and 5. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man who has a quiver full of them. To the ancient warrior, an arrow was the primary offensive weapon. It was the long-range weapon. In contrast to weapons such as a sword or spear, which were offensive, they were used for short-range battle, one-on-one type thing, but an arrow was long-range. Arrows were propelled by strength and according to the arm of the archer. You know, it's because of the English longbow that today we speak English. Because it could have been that the French won and we'd be speaking French, but it was because of 200 English archers that went up against all of the knights of the French army and literally slayed them almost to the man, that we speak English today. It was the English longbow that did it. And if you do a study of all of the surnames in the English language that deal with archery, and it's just a wonderful. Bowman, Boyer, Archer, Fletcher, Pointer, Schaffner, Stringer. I mean, on and on and on you can go, because the arrow was the most important strategic long-range weapon there was. Now, here's the thing about arrows. Number one, they have to be shaped. I remember when I was a kid, I had an archery, had a bow and arrow and a target and all that. And I bought these arrows for 35 cents at usually Woolworths or someplace, some dime store. And they very quickly warped. And so I had all these arrows that were misshapen. And my dad saw them and he said, I can help you fix that, boy. And he took a 1x2 and he drilled a hole in one end of it. And he said, put those arrows over a boiling pot of water and steam them. And so I did. And then he took that and he put that arrow in that hole and he started bending that arrow with that stick. And he straightened them. You know, that's exactly what they did. They made sure that the arrow itself was absolutely, completely straight. So arrows have to be shaped. They have to have a point. They have to be fletched. There is something that you have to do to them. And if you compare an arrow to a child has to be straightened. A child has to be pointed. A child has to have stability for direction. An arrow must be shaped. It must be directed. It must be pointed toward the target. One of the things we see today is that parents aren't directing their children toward the target of being godly children. The third thing, an arrow must be released. An arrow does no good notched, sitting in a bow. It only does its job when it is released. And so our children have to be released to do their work. Like arrows, this similitude importeth that children must have more in them than nature, for arrows are no arrows by growth, but by art. So must be such children. The naughtiness of the nature is refined and reformed and made smooth by grace, and then they are cared for. I thought that that was so important to recognize. Arrows are no arrows by growth, but by art. Making straight arrows is an art. Parents raising a child is an art. If they are left to their own devices, they will not grow up. They may look like an adult, but they won't be. It's an art. We have a job to do. So the children are our legacy. That's what it talks about in the last part of verse number 5. It says, they will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. Now you can take that two ways. The way I see that particular verse is they, the children, the arrows, will not be ashamed when they speak to the enemies in the gate. These are the ones that we have raised to carry on the work. So children are a legacy. A team of New York state sociologists once attempted to calculate the lasting influence of a father's life upon his children and those who followed in subsequent generations. The two men were researched who lived the same time in the 18th century. The lasting legacies of each man left upon his descendants stands as different as night and day. The first man was Max Jukes. He was an unbeliever, not principled. His wife also lived and died in unbelief. What kind of lasting influence did he leave on his family? Among the 1,200 known descendants of Max Jukes were 440 lives in outright debauchery, 310 paupers and vagrants, 190 public prostitutes, 130 convicted criminals, 100 alcoholics, 60 habitual thieves, 55 victims of impurity, and 7 murderers. Not an enviable legacy, is it? The other man they studied was Jonathan Edwards, the colonial pastor, perhaps one of the greatest theologians America has produced. But he came from a godly heritage. And he married Sarah Pierpoint, a woman of great faith. Together they sought to leave an entirely different legacy. Among his male descendants were 300 clergymen, missionaries, or theological professors, 120 college professors, 110 lawyers, over 60 physicians, over 60 authors of good books, 30 judges, 14 presidents of universities, numerous giants in American industry, 3 United States congressmen, and 1 vice president of the United States. There it is. The difference. Our children are our legacy. There's an old German saying, "An Gottes Segen ist alles gelegen." Everything depends on God's blessing. Everything depends on God's blessing. In Edinburgh, Scotland, the city seal in Latin reads, Nisi Dominus frustra. Without the Lord, frustration. The motto appears on all city documents, and both of these sayings ought to be inscribed wherever we work. Everything depends on God's blessing. Without the Lord is frustration. To these mottos we can add, unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Benjamin Franklin, not noted for being a great Christian, quoted the opening words of Psalm 127 in a challenge to the Continental Congress. And this is what he said. Do we imagine that we no longer need God's assistance? The longer I live, the more convincing proof I see in this truth that God governs the affairs of men. Without his concurring aid, we shall proceed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. It will all be for naught unless we build with the Lord's help. One day, Henry Ford was driving along Michigan road in the countryside, and he came upon a man. He was working on his Model T Ford. He was trying to figure out what was wrong, wouldn't run. And Ford got out and came over and asked if he could take a look. And the man, frustrated, yeah, go ahead. And so he said, I think I can fix this. In a few minutes, Henry Ford had the car running. And the man said, I can't believe, I'm amazed. You fixed this so easily. You fixed my car so easily. And Ford said, well, I ought to be able to fix it. I'm the one who built it. You know, let's apply that to the Lord. When things are bad and when things are broken and we try to fix it, we're puzzled. We can't understand. Let the Lord fix it. He's the one who made you. Let him fix you. This highlights the need for unceasing prayer. A.C. Dixon said this very well. We depend on our organizations, we'll get what organizations can do. When we depend on education, we get what education can do. When we depend on man, we get what man can do. But when we depend on God in prayer, we get what God can do. We get what God can do. He is the great builder. He's the carpenter. He is our sentry. He is our farmer. He is our procreator. He is our God. Let's depend on him. Will you pray with me? Father, indeed, we come to you today, depending completely upon you, because you indeed have the words of eternal life. You indeed have created us. You know when we need to be fixed, that you really are the only one who can fix us. And so we come to you. We ask you, Lord, to heal our brokenness so that we can be useful unto you all the days of our life. And we'll praise you and thank you for that wonderful privilege. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.